Hello, class. Today we will be in groups discussing our project on choosing a form of government that we think is best. And in order to do this, you guys will be brainstorming. And so I'm going to walk you guys through what my process for that would look like. I want, at the very bare minimum, we need to be identifying our assumptions. So first of all, what makes a government good and why do we think these governments that we're suggesting would fit into that? We need to check our validity of our assumptions and consider alternate perspectives or explanations and be open to really discussing with your classmates. And finally, you need to take an action, right? And so we were going to be at the end picking one form of government to do our project on, right? And so as we begin, the first thing you guys should be thinking about is what are the aspects of government that make it good, right? Does it need to serve the will of the people? Does it need to be effective? What safeguards should be in place? How stable should it be? All of these things are things that you guys should be considering, and I do want you to imagine it through a critical lens. And so what that could look like, for instance, would be one assumption I would have would be that a government should be powerful, right? It is great to understand what the people need, what the people want, but if you can't give it to them, then ultimately the people aren't going to support the government. And so, one example we can look to for that would be Shays' Rebellion, which was about slightly after the Revolutionary War. There was a rebellion in the South, and the Articles of Confederation, which we were governed by at the time, did not actually give the federal government enough power to go in and deal with the rebellion that occurred. And so you certainly want to have a form of government that has the power to exercise what it needs to do. And so, for instance, if you look at the assumption there, we can check the validity. And in this case, oh, that's probably valid because governments need to be able to um, if they are serving the people or serving themselves, they are going to be ineffective. They cannot do what they are seeking to accomplish. And in this case, power would be important. And so, one way we can check our assumption is it the most important would be to think about a form of government that is really powerful, like a monarchy, for example. And we could see that a monarchy is probably pretty stable as long as the family stays in place and no one gets overthrown. They're pretty dynamic, right? They can start wars, they can lead wars, they can change laws on a whim to accomplish what the people need, what they need. But is this good? Right? Like one thing in a monarchy is the people don't have a voice. They don't have rights. And so in this case, we could potentially think that, oh, maybe power shouldn't actually be the most important thing. And so in checking that assumption, we can see maybe it does need to be adjusted. Maybe an alternate perspective needs to be taken. In this case, perhaps there was a flaw, right? And so did anyone catch the error? Right. Exactly. So in a monarchy, sometimes you actually can have rights. We can look at something like the Magna Carta. And so it is important to check your assumptions, not only of what makes a government good, but different aspects of government. And so, yes, even though the Magna Carta does give some rights, does this really change our perspective on power being the most important thing in government? I'm not so sure, right? Maybe would be better to have a government that puts serving the people ahead of being able to do whatever it wants to do. And so in this case, we would probably go ahead and choose an alternate perspective, right? What if we put serving the people at the forefront? And then the question would be, well, how can we let the people give their voice? And one very common form of democracy that, or there it is, gave the answer out already, but very common form of government that does allow citizens to participate in elections and choose their leaders would be democracy. And democracy would be good if we are strictly looking through the lens of giving people power, right? Because especially in a direct democracy, people would even be voting on the laws themselves. And we can surmise that this is good. But what if the people want something that is bad, right? And so maybe we now go back to our assumption that, oh, whatever the people want would be good. Sometimes there do need to be safeguards in place. And um, one other question here with a democracy is one of stability, right? What is the value of having a single leader that's in place for a lifetime rather than, for instance, in America, sometimes elections can happen as often as, every 2 years. Some terms are shorter than others, but even at the executive, right? Technically, we're a republic, which we'll get into. But every 4 years, right, there's somebody new at the head, and it does add a layer of difficulty in getting things done quickly or even in standing up to what the majority of people want to do. Actually, one precedent we could look at as to the instability of democracies could be Plato's Republic, where he essentially describes democracies as a market where people sort of shop for the form of government that they want, because democracies are very inherently unstable. And so in this case, maybe again, we want, instead of focusing, maybe one assumption we could change our perspective on would be, instead of focusing on one value to put above all the others, whether it's power, um, allowing the people's voices to be heard, stability. One thing could maybe be to combine different forms of government to lead to a more well-rounded form that doesn't necessarily focus on one aspect, but does combine a lot of aspects. And that would, of course, be the American constitutional republic that we have today, where we do see a centralized power with a figurehead. But there are obviously opportunities for citizens to have their voices heard. And on top of that, we do have safeguards in place, which can sometimes actually run counter to the will of the people. Obviously, the protests in as a result of the Supreme Court decision on Roe versus Wade, for example, is one where there was a lot of public outcry. And actually, it didn't matter at all, because the way the Supreme Court works is it's not at all about public opinion. It is essentially working as an oligarchy, right? And so now we're looking at some of the weaknesses of the republic, right? And so as you evaluate these different forms of government, it is important to critically analyze not only what are you valuing, but how can this government live into those values, and what are some of the shortcomings, right? And based on those shortcomings, right, for the American Republic, for instance, maybe, there are all these aspects of oligarchy and even monarchy with the executive, right, that maybe we would want to get away from, and your group could decide, well, maybe we would want to go back to democracy, right? And so in this case, the action you're going to take is all about finding the government that you think works best.